Welcome back to another episode of What's on My Radar. I'm your host, obviously, meteorologist Reed Kisselback, also known as Radar Reed. And today's topic, we always get asked a lot of questions about this, especially in the summertime, as a lot of folks getting ready for their summer vacation. There's hurricanes, and I figured there's no better person to ask to come on the podcast today than my old college advisor, and certainly my professor as well from my time at UAlbany, and that would be Dr. Kristen Corbosiero. Kristen, thank you for being a part of the show today. Doing well?
Yes, doing great. Really happy to be here. Happy to come on and support you and talk about hurricanes.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of us can admit we like hurricanes for sure.
Yes.
What got you into hurricanes specifically?
I grew up in eastern Massachusetts, and I remember when Hurricane Bob hit New England. That was 1985, a long time ago. But we didn't have power for about a week. We didn't have a ton of damage, but sort of southeast New England had a lot of damage. And I think that really maybe sparked my first interest in hurricanes.
Yeah, I know for myself, I remember Katrina in 2005 being glued to the Weather Channel and watching Jim Cantori with all those live reports. And I do remember even just here locally, Irene, sitting in my house watching like the trees pretty much almost come out of the ground, but not quite get there. And that got me curious enough there too.
Yeah. Irene actually happened right when I moved back to Albany. So I had lived here again for about a month, and it was an experience.
Certainly is. And I mean, you can still see the scars in some spots too from it too, which is always interesting to see when you're out and about some of the spots. But yeah, so let's ask some questions about hurricane season. I hope you are ready to. No, I'm just kidding. You're more ready than I am probably on this topic for sure. But can you just talk to us a little bit, because they hear us say this all the time, but just what is needed for a hurricane to form, and why?
So obviously the first thing we need are warm waters, generally above about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So really toasty, warm seawater. The waters also need to be warm over a pretty good depth of the ocean, that you can't have really shallow warm water, because the hurricane goes over, it really mixes up the water. So you don't want really cool water below that. Also need the winds above the developing storm to be relatively quiet. So that's how the winds change with height, is known as vertical wind shear. You want that to be low. In our current climate, storms don't just randomly form. They need to form from something. That something in the Atlantic is usually a group of thunderstorms that moves off of Africa and then moves across the Atlantic. Storms also don't form right on the equator, so that's another thing you need. I'm trying to think about all those things that I teach you guys. Oh, also, it needs to be humid, right? So this summer, we've had a lot of dew points in the 70s. A hurricane needs it to be pretty humid.
Yeah, for sure. And let's talk about the actual hurricane season outlook that the Weather Service puts out. So they're calling for the 17 to 25 named storms, 8 to 13 of them being hurricanes, and then 4 to 7 major hurricanes. What exactly are forecasters looking at when they put together this outlook?
Yeah, so when they're looking at things that are sort of change on longer timescales in the atmosphere. So things like El Nino. They look at sort of the long-term trends in what do the sea surface temperatures look like? Kind of what have they been over the winter and into the spring? They look at sort of areas of high and low pressure that are sort of average over the Atlantic. So they're looking at things that sort of vary on a slower time scale than sort of like the highs and lows that go by us, the thunderstorms. But a lot of it does have to come from El Nino and sort of the overall state of the atmosphere, and kind of, again, what those sea surface temperatures look like going into the season.
It's always really fascinating to see how they can come up with a forecast like this and actually have it pan out really well too when you're looking at such long-term things like that. So let's touch on Beryl too this year, because that's what, if I'm not mistaken, right, earliest Category 5 on record.
Broke all kind of records.
Yeah, I mean, can you touch a little bit more on that, especially from your side on the research standpoint? I'm sure it had to be really fascinating to watch it unfold.
Yeah, so Beryl basically broke almost all of our sort of early season records for hurricanes in terms of most intense, going through rapid intensification multiple times, not really weakening during those time periods, withstanding some unfavorable conditions for a bit. And it's certainly a case that we're going to look at in more detail, but I think one of the main drivers here, as I mentioned before, is the warm sea surface temperatures and how deep those waters extend down into the ocean. That I think everybody, as you said, that the NOAA predictions were for a very active season, and I think that if we have warmer waters earlier in the season, then it's not unexpected that storms are going to develop earlier and be really intense.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize it's hurricane season June 1st through November, and usually we hit our peak in September. So to get a Category 5 that early was certainly, for us on our end behind camera, I'm sure you were like this and the whole department was, but we're like, this is pretty cool. Sitting here looking at it, and we're like, well, it's not cool for anybody who's going to get impacted by it, but we're obviously from the standpoint of us, it's fascinating to look at. Speaking about just the hurricanes and using the Saffir-Simpson scale. Why exactly do we use wind to project the risk? Because I know a lot of the time one of the biggest issues they always talk about is flooding.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously with Debbie, that's happening now in the southeast United States, the flooding and storm surge are the biggest issues, right? That there are forecasts of up to 30 inches of rain in parts of the Carolinas. So with some storms that almost all storms actually, rain and storm surge are the most deadly parts of the storm, and really present a huge amount of risk. But I think we use wind because that's what we can measure, right? And it's sort of an overall measure of the storm of how intense it is. And I think it kind of goes back to sort of classical measurements of thinking about how strong a storm is, that we usually think about it, it's pressure, right? We talk about high or low pressure, how low the pressure is or how strong the winds are. Those two things are related. But moving to something, thinking about risk related, sort of how we should rate storms, that's super, super important, especially in a warmer climate where the atmosphere is holding more water. We're getting more rain from storms. Sea levels are higher. So thinking about these things in terms of risk is super, super important.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we worked on research-wise together for school. So yeah, it's an interesting topic, and I think there's a lot of interesting scales coming out. But I think right now the wind's the way to go, like you mentioned, because it's what you can measure in that current time, which is it's a very valid point. Can we touch on this? Is something we always like to talk about when we were tracking hurricanes, but eyewall replacement cycles.
Yeah.
I know we bring that up a lot. We can't really mention it too much on air because, one, we don't have enough time, but I don't think we'd have enough time to actually explain what that is. So can you explain that for us?
Yeah, and actually Beryl was a case that had an eyewall replacement cycle. So what happened, we think about a hurricane with its eyewall. I saw a number of reporters this morning and Debbie in the eyewall of the storm as it came across Florida. So that's where the strongest winds and the heaviest rainfall is. And sometimes in storms, we don't quite understand exactly what causes it to happen, but in very strong storms, so not in Debbie, but in Beryl, that was a stronger storm, a secondary eye wall, so another ring of fast winds and heavy rainfall will form outside of that first eye wall, and it'll replace it. It'll take over as the primary eye wall, the one at a bigger distance from the center, and the inner one sort of weakens and dies. And then what happens is this outer eye wall then replaces the inner one, and it can contract, go to smaller distance. And in Beryl, it was really interesting that a lot of storms will weaken after they go through this eye wall replacement cycle, and Beryl really didn't. It stayed pretty strong and underwent another period of rapid intensification. So that's another really interesting research topic to look at in Beryl.
Yeah, I mean, that one's always, it's just fascinating to look at that part. For an eye wall replacement cycle, you can see the bands form, and it's exciting for us to watch it for sure. The other question that I know we usually get asked with is, why is it that the eye wall, you get the most intense rain right around the eye itself. So you get all that intense rain and wind, and then you just have that calm. Why is it always right there? Why is it not farther out?
So we know that hurricanes, as they get their all of their moisture and all of their intensity sort of from the heat of the ocean. And so I always say that hurricanes in, up, and out. So there's inflow of warm, moist air at the bottom. It rises in the eye wall. Some of that air then sinks in the clear eye, but then a lot of it goes out at the top. You kind of look at satellite loops of hurricanes. You can see all the sort of clouds at the top spiraling outward. And sort of how small that eye wall gets does relate to intensity. Usually stronger storms have a smaller eye and eye wall. But what kind of sets that is something we're still kind of working on. It might have to do with the size of the initial sort of disturbance that causes the storm to form. And it's still sort of an area of active research. But really that eye wall is where all the most intense part of the storm is happening, because all of that air is flowing into the center of the storm.
Makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. Sure. I don't know if I'd ever be able to say it as smoothly as you just did if I was asked to say it on air. So kudos to you, Kristen.
Just in, up, and out. That's all you need to remember.
In, up, and out. I remember that one for sure. Yep. I still got the notes at home for tropical meteorology. So it was a good class. Kristen, thank you again for taking the time to talk with us. It was really helpful of you. And I'm sure as hurricane season progresses, I know we're going to have a special. Christina will be talking to you at some point. And so I look forward to hearing what she asks you and what you have to say.
Awesome. I'm always happy to talk to former students. So it's great.
Thanks, Kristen. Have a good one.
Thanks. You're welcome. Take care, Reed.
What we see for a hurricane is 4 different quadrants, right? So what to expect if you're in those spots can vary by your location. And so we'll kind of touch on this more so from the standpoint of a hurricane maybe trying to come up the coastline, kind of like what Irene and Sandy did. So you have your 4 quadrants. In the back right, that's where you see the highest winds for the hurricane itself. As you move to the front right, that's where you have the maximum hurricane impact. You have the strong winds, and you have the most significant flooding in those spots. Back left is the weakest, but it's still dangerous. And then in the front left is where you have the most significant storm surge, which is pretty interesting to see. We also have a lot of brave people who go into these hurricanes and get the real-time observations for us so that we can better predict the track and the intensification of these hurricanes. And in April, the hurricane hunters from NOAA and from the Air Force Reserves actually came to Albany Airport. I took the time to go over there, and we interviewed one of the pilots there, Captain Ashley Kostruck. Here's that interview.
Most people go the opposite way from a hurricane.
Sure.
You're choosing to fly right into them.
Right.
Why?
Well, we are basically the truth source for the Hurricane Center and feeding into those forecast models. Radar and satellite can only give you so much information, and once we actually get into the storm environment and into that center, once it becomes a fixed mission, we're giving them that, like I said, the truth source, and we can update their forecast real time.
What made you want to be a hurricane hunter?
Well, I'm glad you asked. So I grew up in Gulfport, Mississippi. I was actually born in Biloxi, Mississippi at Keesler Air Force Base, and my family was affected by Hurricane Katrina. My dad was a Biloxi police officer. So I was able, my dad, when he was Biloxi police officer, was able to get us down on Highway 90. Again, 2005 Hurricane Katrina. I was about 12 years old and was affected by the storm. And I have these pictures here from Highway 90. So this was one of the barges. The casino was actually lifted up by the storm surge and taken across Highway 90. And this is where it landed. You can see where it was gutted, and actually driving across Highway 90, all you saw were the oak trees. The oak trees sustained Hurricane Katrina, and then just stairs. The stair steps into foundations of houses that were taken away. And that's what we saw while we were down there. This was the Ocean Springs Bridge. There's my dad right there. We were able to see the damage that was done on Highway 90 of the Ocean Springs Bridge. And if you ever visit the area, it's a beautiful bridge now, but it's a huge high rise to avoid that storm surge that happened there then. So this is most of the pictures. That was one of the casinos. It's different now.
Wow.
Try not to look at the camera.
Yeah.
And then there's the close-up shot. So.
That's
This
very
was
cool.
Hurricane Katrina, and this was one of the motivations behind me trying to do this mission.
What kind of training do you need?
To be a pilot, you have to go to college, get a college degree. It doesn't necessarily have to be a STEM degree, and then you go through either officer training school, the academy, or ROTC program. Then you'll go through the wickets and then eventually end up at pilot training. For our specific airframe for C-130, we'll go to C-130 Schoolhouse, which is in Little Rock, Arkansas. And then from there, we'll do the weather-specific mission. You don't learn how to fly through a hurricane, you just do it.
Gotcha. Do you request this, or do they assign this to you? Like,
As a reservist, you're
Yeah.
able to rush a unit. So
Okay.
you interview with them and they have to pick you. They have to select
Gotcha.
you.
Okay.
And they sponsor you through training.
cool. Very cool. How many flights have you done?
That's a great question. I have 20 storm penetrations,
Awesome.
so we have penny patches, and I've been through the eye wall 20 times.
Awesome. That's very cool. How do you handle the rough conditions?
As a team, it's a team
Yeah.
effort. Yes, you just have to trust the process. We slow to storm penetration speed, and we have our checklist that we go through. For our aircraft, we go no higher than 181 knots. Obviously, as we start burning gas, we get lighter. That speed's going to start dropping off, but that ensures that we won't overspeed the aircraft or over-G, no mechanical failures. But we also have to maintain that airspeed too, so we don't stall. And just like us, you and me, we're made up of the same stuff, but we're individuals, right? So the storms are made up of the same stuff too, but they're all unique, so you never know what you're gonna get. So there's really no way to prepare for it. We just follow our regimented checklist and hope for the best.
Awesome. What would you say, in your memory, was the worst hurricane you've flown through, and why?
I would have to say, so I've been through Hurricane Ian, I've been through Hurricane Ian. It was a great storm, but one of the worst ones was Hurricane Roslyn. No one's probably ever heard of it because it was over the Pacific, over the mountains of Mexico, and it was at night. We were flying over the mountains, descending through hail, and it had the mountain wave interaction at nighttime, and I was seasoned at this point. I was strapped down, ready to go, hanging on. The other pilot was flying, and it was like we just hit a wall. Stuff went flying in the cockpit. Everything was scattered, and I remember I had a tin of cupcakes, and the cupcakes were smeared all over the plastic. I didn't eat them. I brought them back to the step desk, but it's still just a memory.
Yeah.
To this day, at 1 in the morning, nighttime, you can't see anything except a little bit of hail, and then whew, turbulence, and that's it.
Wow, that's crazy. What would you say is your most memorable hurricane you've gone through?
Hurricane Ian.
Yeah.
We were flying it as it was making landfall during the day. Only so many people are able to see that stadium effect of a major hurricane in the daytime. So as it was making landfall as a major hurricane, we got the stadium effect. And I look down and I see an island off of the coast of Florida. House is still standing in the eye wall, but meanwhile, we're relatively safe in the plane, in the eye wall, knowing that the last southwest quadrant is about to impact right where those people are. The houses were still standing at that point, but they still had another half, since they were safe in the eye wall, they had another half of hurricane to go.
Yeah. What keeps bringing you back?
The adrenaline, the thrill, and then also I got into this because I wanted to give back.
Yeah.
Since I was affected growing up, I know how much this impacts everyone, and it's a way for me to feel like I'm giving back.
I like that. Describe for me a typical time frame leading up to a flight.
A time frame?
Yeah,
so,
like what's going on right before you get there.
Okay, well, you'll get alerted, then you'll have to hustle into the squadron, make sure you have your coffee and your flight snacks. I don't know if you've been on the plane, but we have a microwave. So if you don't have time, you might just pick up some frozen stuff, and then that's when the microwave isn't gonna work. So you'll get in, you'll brief, you'll get your weather officer brief. They'll let you know what the coordinates of the storm are, millibars, and where it's headed. And then we're out to find it from there. We'll brief, we'll step, we'll fly. Sometimes it's 4 hours en route to the storm. So you're droning, and then you get a quick adrenaline rush when you get in there, get in the storm. It wakes you right back up. So about 12 hours later, then we'll land.
Cool. Yeah, describe a flight for me. How busy does it get? How many of you are on the plane with you?
A minimum of 5 on our crew, so 2 pilots, 1 nav, 1 load master or drops on operator, and then a weather officer as well. Sometimes we'll have an augmented crew depending on how long the sorties are. Basically, in the terminal phases of flight, takeoff and landing is when it's the busiest. And then sometimes we'll get on HF, high frequency radio, and we have to check in, but it's a loud squealing noise for 8 hours on the HF. And that can be a little taxing and draining on us, but most of the time it's just terminal phases of flight, takeoff, landing, and then getting into our WRA, our weather reconnaissance area, because we'll check in, we'll set it up with ATC or ATCA and let them know what we're doing. And then all the while, we're going into the storm, while airliners, you can hear them trying to constantly avoid it. They'll be checking in with ATC, it's a rough ride up here, and all you can think about are the passengers.
Yeah.
Like, poor guys.
Sure. So you guys doing like a figure 8 when you go through, or?
We do what's called an alpha pattern, so
Okay.
it's more like a Z or an X.
Okay.
And we'll, on a fixed storm, we're making sure we get all 4 quadrants, getting all the information, dropping the drop zones. So each quadrant, eye wall, and the center of the storm, and we fix the storm. And sometimes those coordinates that the NHC or the weather officers receive can be up to 100 miles off, because satellite and radar is only so accurate.
Yeah.
So we're there to be, again, the truth source and pass along the most up-to-date data.
Cool. All right, I got 2 more for you.
Okay.
One, describe for me the feeling for you. I'm sure even if you can't, try to remember your first time, but going through the eye wall into the eye. What was that process like, and like what do you remember most, and what stood out to you?
My first hurricane, I believe it was Hurricane Earl, and it was very calm. So if they're well defined and they're not going through an eye wall replacement cycle or building up or breaking down, they're fairly smooth. My instructor or aircraft commander at the time had the autopilot on and was reading a book. And this was my first hurricane, and he had over 300 penetrations.
Okay.
And he's reading, and I'm just sitting there. I'm like, okay, here we go. First one. And it was smooth, it was calm. Again, you don't know what to expect. When you get the real butt-kicking storms, it's when it wakes you up and realize, you really always have to be on your toes. There's no way really to prepare for it. You just have to trust the process and yourself at the same time in your training.
Sure, that's awesome. And then can you just describe for me the plane itself, like what any instruments on it? Just
Yeah,
describe
absolutely.
It. Yeah, talk about the plane.
We're a C-130J. We're 6-bladed. Weather instruments, if you look over right there,
Okay.
we have a SMRF. It's the step microwave frequency radiometer. That's one of the weather instruments. It detects the emissivity of the surface, so it gets sea state and rain rate, and then that feeds into the weather officers' models, which they have on the inside. There's a weather palette, and we drop the drop zones out of there. The weather officer and the load master work hand in hand to send that information out real time. And then also on, say, tropical tidbits or websites that track us, our actual aircraft data refreshes every 10 seconds and feeds into that as well. So there's a lot going on. Again, adding back to that truth source, we are the truth source for feeding into the forecast.
No, that's fair. I lied. I had one more question that came up to me. Say a little kid's watching this and wants to be just like you when they grow up. What advice could you give them? How do they get to be where you are?
Persistence. If you're told no, which I was, not by anyone in particular, there can be roadblocks. You have to be persistent. It's not easy. You will have a lot of big personalities that you have to work with, and you just have to have thick skin for every aspect of the journey.
Pretty incredible stuff, I know. Well, thank you everybody for watching this episode of What's on My Radar. Again, I'm meteorologist Reed Kisselback. Make sure you come on back. We'll have a couple more good episodes heading your way with some other really interesting weather topics. We'll see you soon.